Welcome to Ladies Talking Love, Season 3, Episode 9, A Reason for Sexual Purity. It's Ladies Talking Love, a community of women uncovering more joy and fulfillment in sex, as we learn from experts and amazing women like you. Together, let's create a world where women's sexuality is celebrated and understood, beginning with our own. I'm your host, Ariel Finlinson. Let's talk love. This week's episode has a lot of great thoughts to think about and things to start implementing as a parent. Specifically, if you've come from a religious background where purity culture was present. And I think for many of us, this culture can be really a big part of how we view sexuality and how we view sex going into marriage, and even how we interact in our sexual relationship with our spouse. And so I hope that this episode, even though we're specifically focusing on teaching our kids about sex and sexuality and trying to shift the way that we teach them from some of the harmful things that came from purity culture to a better way, I hope that it's also a great little session of therapy for you to start thinking about, how am I being affected by ways I may have been taught about purity culture. And if you haven't already, go back and listen to Season 2, Episode 22 with Dr. Camden Morgante. And in that episode, we deep dive into unpacking purity culture for yourself, which, as we talk about in this episode, is where we need to start if we're going to try to shift this culture for our kids. So take a listen to Season 2, Episode 22, and then, of course, this one to work on yourself, but then also be able to have some great tips and tools about how to talk with your kids about sexuality and about modesty, about waiting to have sex until you're married, about these things that may be really important in your faith tradition, but you're not exactly sure how to teach them without the shame or the false promises that you may have been taught when you were growing up. Dr. Camden Morgante is a licensed clinical psychologist and former college professor. She writes and speaks about relationships, sexuality, and faith, and is a regular contributor to Christians for Biblical Equality's blog, Mutuality. She is currently writing a book on the myths of purity culture. Dr. Camden also provides coaching services for purity culture recovery, egalitarianism, and faith reconstruction. She lives in Knoxville, Tennessee with her husband, their daughter and son, and 2 rescue dogs. Before jumping in, I just wanted to let you know that I'm here for you and I see you. It took me so long, and still is a struggle sometimes, to talk about my sexual relationship with my partner. It's such a vulnerable space and can be really hard, especially if you're new at it and just starting the conversation. And so I created 10 conversation starter questions to help you start the conversation about sex with your partner. I hope for those of you that are maybe struggling to start that conversation, that this can be an easy segue to start asking questions about what you both expect in your sex life and what you're hoping for your sexual encounters to be like. I've linked the download in the show notes. It's free, so please go ahead and download that. And I hope that it's a great chance for you and your partner to open up that conversation and to start working on making this a beautiful part of your relationship. But without further ado, let's talk love. I'm excited to welcome back Dr. Camden Morgante onto Ladies Talking Love. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Ariel.
I am excited to talk more about purity culture. Our previous episode we did together was about purity culture and how that affects us and our sexuality as adults. And today I wanted to take a little more time to focus on how we can kind of shift the harmful messages we received from purity culture in the way that we are teaching our kids about sexuality. So let's just start off. What are some of the ways that parents may be talking to their kids about purity culture just through the traditions that we grew up with? How is purity culture showing up in our parenting?
Yeah, well, like anything with parenting, it always starts with us rather than our kids. We always have to take responsibility first. And I think if we don't do the work of examining the ways we were parented or the ways we were taught about sex and sexual values, then we're just going to pass on the same things we heard. And we might not want to do that depending on what our experience was like, especially if we grew up in purity culture. So just as I talk about like reparenting yourself and doing the work of deconstructing like the discipline and the ways that you're parented, we need to do the same for sex ed and sexual values, like deconstructing the ways we were taught those things and wanting to separate what do I want to pass on to my children, like what was good from my upbringing, and then what do I want to do differently. So I think it starts with us examining and analyzing our own upbringing and what we want to do similarly or differently.
Can you give some examples, maybe even from your own upbringing, of what were some things that you noticed where, okay, this isn't exactly what I want to pass on to my kids, and these were some good messages I got?
Oh, I definitely have a lot I can say about that. Yes. The way that I was taught about sex, just to get into that, I think in sixth grade, and it was before you were going to have the sex talk in health class or whatever that they normally do around that time. And so before that happened, my parents bought a Focus on the Family, James Dobson book, gave it to me and said, okay, like here, read this and let us know if you have any questions. And that was it. I didn't have any questions. After that kind of intro, I wasn't going to come back to them and ask anything. And so I know they were doing the best that they could. And I was the oldest too. So it was their first time, and it's awkward and hard for parents too. So I have some empathy for that, but it really shut down the conversation between us and gave me the idea like, okay, if I want to know more about this, I've got to seek it out on my own rather than going to my parents. So that was some of the things I didn't want to do. Another thing was I got a lot of, we'll tell you when you're older, whenever I would ask a question. And I got that response so much when I would ask questions that it got to the point where I started keeping like a list of here are my questions that mom keeps saying, we'll get back to it when you're older, or I'll tell you when you're older. So I can remember what those are. And today when I'm older, I can pull out that list and ask her these questions. I don't think
You're like, what age? Can I put my age on here? I have to wait till
it was never clear what age that was. But and I know I did not do that. I did not pull out that list. But it made me think every time I got that response, it was also shutting down the conversation. And it was also kind of a little bit shaming. Like, why are you asking that? You don't need to know that. And so I think I want to do that differently for my children. I don't want to just give them a book and send them away, although books can definitely be helpful additions to the conversation. And I don't want to shut down their questions. I think we're responding with like, that's a good question. Let me think about that. Or let's talk about that when we get home, if we're, out and about, or finding age appropriate ways to answer that question to give them just a little piece of the answer rather than the whole reproduction lesson or something. I think that's what I'm going to strive for with my children.
And I love that idea because I think so many of us are just nervous because it can be a hard topic, especially if this is new for you and you didn't have a good way of talking about sex modeled in your family or in other people that you knew. And it can be so intimidating. Like, I don't know what to say. I'm going to say the wrong thing, but it's been so helpful for me to realize that just having the conversation be open. And as a parent saying, oh, I'm so sorry. I don't think I explained that well. I went back and did some looking into it. And here is what I actually want to tell you. And I feel like that helps our kids just create a space of trust and also know that their parents are willing to dig into the hard things with them. I love that, to just like keep the conversation open.
I think that shows humility too, of like mom and dad don't know it all, but they take my questions seriously enough. I'm important enough that they're going to look up that answer or they're going to come back to me and clarify something they said. So I think that's a very powerful way to repair if we have made a mistake in how we've talked about it or kind of missed an opportunity.
Yes. And I was curious, I know it's so different for everyone, but just from your experience, would you say that more of the harmful purity culture messaging came through your faith tradition or from your family, or kind of a mix?
I definitely got talks about purity from my parents. And some of that was actually really good. You were asking kind of about what I wouldn't want to do, but also there were some things that were good and that I do appreciate. I'd say more of the harmful stuff came from books for me, actually. Came from a lot of Christian dating books or books that were targeted towards teen girls, some from like youth group growing up, but just broader evangelical Christian culture in general for me was the main way that I was getting those messages.
I know it's such like a mix for all of us. I feel like mine was a mix. Like some was from messages of my parents, and not to blame them because they were passing on the information that they thought was good for us, and then from just this culture that was inherent in religion. So what are some of the ways that you've seen it was harmful to you and that some of these traditions can be harmful to our kids?
I write a lot about just purity culture, like we talked about. And if people listen to that first episode, they'll have a little more context and background. But I think just anytime we're talking about sex, we want to incorporate our family's beliefs and values into that. And we want to teach our kids what our beliefs are while allowing them the freedom and autonomy to make decisions for themselves about their beliefs along the way. So I think that is something that I want to do, but I also want to be careful not to offer easy answers or false promises, which is a lot of where I feel like purity culture failed me, is these false promises of if you remain pure or abstinent or a virgin, then you'll get a fantastic sex life and you'll have a husband and just a great marriage at a very early age. And that just didn't happen for me. So I think we don't want to offer those if-then guarantees because that's just not the way that faith really works in the real world. And we also want our kids to have a deeper reason for wanting to internalize these values that we're teaching them. We don't want it to just be to get some reward that, again, like I said, it can be a false promise, or to avoid punishment or avoid looking bad or avoid negative judgments from people. So we want it to be a more deeply internalized value because that's what's going to stick for the long run into young adulthood when it gets much harder to make these choices. Past your adolescence, a lot of the reasons for sexual abstinence just really don't hold past adolescence. That's what I found for myself. I didn't get married till I was almost 30. And so after teen years, it's like, this really just isn't compelling anymore. So we want our kids to have deeper reasons and deeper whys for why they want to pursue sexual purity.
And I think that's such a good point because if they have these deeper reasons, they're better able to make the choices if they want to live according to those reasons or not. But if we're not allowing them to see or know the deeper reasons, then it can be harder to make educated decisions in their relationships before they get married or as they're preparing for marriage. Carly Palmer Webb just started a podcast, and in her first episode, she talked about some of the Christian myths that a lot of us have been taught, may believe. And one of them was about the best gift we can give our future spouse is our purity. And she's like, no, the best gift you can give your future spouse is you. And just to like shift this culture and know that being a virgin, if that is a part of your faith tradition and something you believe in, like I believe in that, that's part of my faith tradition. And it can be such a beautiful thing to stay abstinent until you get married, but you still need a good education to go into it. And if you haven't stayed a virgin or you've had other experiences, that doesn't mean there's any less of you to give when you get married. And I think shifting that can be so important with our kids. So what are some of the general guidelines you would say for giving the sex talk to your kids?
Well, the first thing would be that it's not just a sex talk. It's an ongoing conversation with multiple little talks throughout their lives. And I interviewed Dr. Tina Shermer Sellers on my Instagram about her book, Shameless Parenting. And she says that the sex talk is not one conversation, but hundreds along the way. And she also made this point that really stuck with me, that we don't have one conversation with our kids about friendship for their whole entire lives, or we don't have one big money talk. We incorporate that into everyday life as it comes up or as they get older, giving them, more information or deeper information. So I feel the same way about sex, making that more ongoing and finding like natural opportunities to bring it up and to talk about it with your kids instead of just this really formal like dinner out where it's just us or like a weekend away with mom, where we're going to have this big sex talk or something like that.
And that can make it feel so awkward and inapproachable. And that the questions can't just roll when we're thinking about them. I really like that Kristen Hodson talks about that as well. It should be like 101-minute talks over a lifespan, just these little moments. So as we're talking about what are some of the guidelines, what are some things you would suggest in talking about sex? You mentioned that it's important to use the correct terms for our children's genitals. Can you talk about that? Why is that so important?
Well, I think it's important because when we use nicknames, it can convey discomfort or insecurity, which can lead to this feeling of shame. So when we give like a cutesy kind of name, or we act very hush hush about a little girl's vulva or a little boy's penis, it conveys this sense of like, this part of my body is different than the rest of my body, because we call my arm an arm, we call my knee a knee, my foot is a foot. So why is this called something different? So there can be a sense of shame with that. And instead, just calling it what it is also gives them the language and vocabulary to empower them with their bodies. And it can help prevent abuse too, which is something that is, I think we're starting to hear more of, that teaching our kids the correct anatomical terms can prevent abuse, or at least help them to disclose it sooner because they have that language that they're empowered with. The potential offender hears the kid using these correct terms. They know someone's talking to this kid about their body. There's these lines of communication are open. This kid's going to be more likely to disclose and not to keep a secret. I say all that not to ever blame parents if their children are sexually abused, if they haven't taught them the correct anatomical terms. That's definitely not 100% guarantee that it won't happen, unfortunately. But just that we can empower our kids by giving them that knowledge.
And it's never too late if you haven't taught your kids and you teach them. Maybe if they have been abused, that'll be able to come out because now they're going to have the words to tell you so you can get the help you need. So it's never too late to start, especially with vulva. It's not just your vagina. So important to know the parts of our body. And no one really ever taught me my vulva and what it consisted of. And so that can be a really great way to start, even with yourself, to then be able to teach your kids.
Yeah. And I actually made that mistake with my daughter when she was first starting to talk and we were bathing her and naming her body parts as we bathed her. I made the mistake of calling it a vagina. After, I guess, a few months of doing that, I realized, I actually should teach her the term vulva instead. So kind of went back on that. And that's the term she uses now. And it's really helpful. Like when she was younger and she had diaper rash or things like that, she could say, my vulva is itchy. I need some cream. I think it gives her that knowledge of her body so that she can communicate with others about it.
Yes, I have had the same experience. And just using those terms, my daughter, even now she's 6 and she can tell me like, oh, my vulva is feeling sore, or kind of hurting. And I love that she feels comfortable and trusts me to tell me about it, but also knows the term for what her vulva is called. And I think especially with younger kids, and it's never too late if you have older kids, but younger kids for me was such a great stage to practice being comfortable with body terms myself, because as I wash them in the tub as they're young, I got the practice of saying all their body terms. And over the years, it's become so much easier to it doesn't feel like any other word to say like vulva, clitoris, vagina, urethra, all these terms, penis, testicles. So that can be such a great way, like you were saying, just washing in the tub and naming the parts of the body.
Yeah. And that's where it becomes that ongoing conversation where we're using these natural opportunities like the bath or like potty training or getting a new sibling. That has opened up the door for a lot of conversations for my family.
Especially if you get a different sex.
Yes. Yes. Which is my situation. I just had a little boy a couple months ago. So my daughter, when I was pregnant, was really interested in like, where's baby brother growing? And like, she thought it was so cool that he was getting food from a cord. Like, what is this about? And then after he was born, we told her he came out of my vagina. And then she's noticed his genitals are different. We've talked about the names of those. And it's just nonchalant for her. Like, it's not a big deal when we say this is baby brother's penis, this is his scrotum with his testicles. And she's just like, oh, testicles. Okay. She's like learning a new word.
Yep. I love that. And so as we're kind of talking about creating this safe space and making it really comfortable, what are some examples that you would give of things to avoid saying when you're talking to your kids about sex and sexual values?
I would say avoid the myths and false promises of purity culture. So you want to avoid both demonizing or idolizing sex. So sometimes we see parents demonize it, like it's really dirty, it's shameful, it's bad, just don't do it. painful. Like they make it sound so bad, maybe in an effort to keep their kids from having sex too young. But then we also don't want to idolize it. We don't want to say things like what you were saying about it's the best gift you can give your spouse, or if you do have premarital sex, you're going to be broken and damaged, or you're a better Christian if you abstain from premarital sex. I heard all of those things a lot and really believed them. And it caused a lot of ugly pride in me. You know, when I did make choices that were these Christian sexual values, I had a lot of pride about that and a lot of judgment of other people who weren't making those choices. Mm-hmm. And that's a sin in and of itself. In my belief, that pride is a sin. And instead, I want my children to have the sense of humility and a recognition that we all need God's grace and forgiveness, regardless of our sexual past or history. So I think that's a message I'd rather instill than these myths of purity culture.
And I just saw a conversation that I loved happening. Kristen Hodson, she's a sex educator as well. And she posted about the term losing your virginity and just how we can shift that to talk about that having sex is gaining a new experience and it can be a part of our growth. And I really appreciate that, because even if in your culture, you wait until you get married, it still almost feels like you're losing something because you've been told your whole life, like they lost their virginity.
Yeah.
No one can take your virginity from you. And it's not about losing something. It's about gaining an experience. And especially when we think about it in committed relationships and marriages, it's about gaining an experience to create a deeper bond. And I loved that idea of shifting from losing something to gaining something.
There's even some of my coaching clients have felt like, am I not pure anymore now that I had sex?
Yeah.
I know that it's okay now that I'm married, but I still can't make that switch, flip that switch in my head that says, oh, now it's okay. So whether it's the sense of I've lost something, I've lost this huge part of my identity. I know for me, purity became this huge part of my identity. I mean, it was a ring that I wore every single day I wore mine for about 10 years. It was a huge part of my identity and a huge sense of pride. So some people can have this sense of like, I've lost this, but I like what you're saying about gaining something. And also that sex is not about give and take. It's about sharing. I look at it as we're sharing sexual intimacy. We're sharing our bodies. We're sharing this holy and very private and personal experience together, just the two of us, that we don't share with anyone else. And that's a beautiful thing to me, to think in those terms, rather than you have to give your husband sex, or you're losing your purity or virginity, or he's taking your purity.
I love using sharing as a way to explain it to my children as well, because I feel like they can understand that. When I talk about me and my husband, sometimes it's like, oh, Papa and I just need some space, because when we're married, we get to share our bodies with each other. That's a way as well that has been helpful to frame what this gift of sexuality can be, that you get to share it. It's not giving, it's not losing, it's sharing and creating an experience of love with someone that you trust. And as you talked about those women who still struggle to shift, which is so, I feel like it can be way more common than I wish it was. What do we talk about to instill some of these faith values and beliefs that are important in our families, but in a way that's not going to create the harmful views of purity culture, and also some of these views of like, oh, now I can't see sex as being good because I was taught so long that it was dirty or bad, or like so sacred that it almost goes to being bad because we don't talk about it.
Well, I think we want to start with your body and sex is beautiful and good, that these are good things and these are good gifts from God. And like any gift, we want to steward it or use it in a way that honors God. So I want to use my body in a way that honors and obeys God. Like the Bible says, offer your body as a living sacrifice to God. My body is a gift, so it's my responsibility to steward it and keep it healthy and use it in ways that honor God. And the same thing with my sexuality. So I think talking to our kids about, we want to have a genuine relationship with God, and that means obedience and following his plans and pursuing purity for a way to honor and give him glory, rather than just to get some reward, or avoid looking bad or judgments from other people. So that's one example.
And you have a 3-year-old, is that right?
Mhm.
And I'm just curious, what are some ways that you've started talking about sex and sexuality with her? Of course, she's 3, so it's probably not super in depth yet.
Yeah, at this point, it's been mostly talking about her body, like we're saying. And then now with baby brother, it's been talking a little bit about how he grew and how he was born and things like that. Sometimes I found ways to naturally instill some values. Like I've said, yeah, mommy and daddy share a bed because we're married. Now, obviously, I know people can share a bed when they're not married, but that's just one way to kind of start to give that idea of this is something that's special for when we're married. Or I've said she sees our wedding pictures and yeah, mommy and daddy made a new family when we got married. And then a couple years later, we had you. And after you're married is when you make a family. Obviously, that doesn't happen for everyone again, and we'll have more in-depth and nuanced conversations about that as she gets older. But I think those are just some small ways with small children that you can start to have these conversations.
And how would you suggest then looking more at teenage, early adulthood, talking about sex with that age group?
It's going to be more complex. There's going to be more questions and more, but that's not how I see it. I'm seeing people who have families and who aren't married, or I'm seeing my friends who are having sex and no one's judging them for it or something like that. Or in my case, like I'm seeing friends that I know had premarital sex get married before me. And that felt really unfair because of the promises I had been told. So I think allowing there to be more complexity and more nuance and allowing there to be sad feelings and validating those. There was a lot of grief for me about being single for a long time and feeling like that was unfair and seeing everyone else around me get married kind of in my friend circle. So validating those feelings. And again, really helping your children find that deeper why. They have to have a deeper reason. And I think it flows out of this genuine faith and genuine relationship with God. I talked about there's not very compelling reasons to stay a virgin past your adolescence. I think unless you have these faith reasons for it. I mean, there's practical reasons for it, like pregnancy, but that can be prevented, and getting your heart broken, but that doesn't always happen. There's going to be exceptions to everything, but it really has to come down to this is a genuine belief that I have that flows out of this relationship that I have with God, and I want to honor him in this way.
And what would you say as a parent teaching your children about that? Of course, they have to kind of come to that own faith on their own. But as a parent who maybe has that faith and wants to instill what you believe, to at least give your children the chance to decide if they believe or not, what are some of the whys that you would teach them why you believe it might be important to wait until you get married to have sex?
Definitely would plan to offer the practical reasons. I definitely plan to do that and talk about the emotional reasons, the relational reasons that your brain is just not mature and developed enough to make those choices as a teenager. I really believe that. And I think there's a lot of psychological evidence for that. Even if we're taking out our religious beliefs, there's reasons for that. But perhaps showing my children in other ways how I steward the gifts God has given me. Me and my husband earn money, and we steward that in a way to try to honor God of how we spend our money, and also giving money to our church or to charities and people in need and things like that. So that could be one example of a way that this doesn't feel like it benefits me in the moment, and it doesn't always feel good to do that or to make these like hard choices with your money or hard choices with your sexuality. But it's a way to obey God and to really have a genuine and deep faith and relationship with him. And I would be careful to avoid saying like, we do this because it makes life easier, because it doesn't always. You know, we follow God's rules because he's happy when we follow his rules. I would hesitate with offering those kind of answers because we don't want it, again, to become a shameful thing where like, oh, if I do mess up, then God doesn't love me anymore. That's definitely not true. So we want to avoid that. But just that God does have these guidelines for us, that he sees the bigger picture and that this is the way that he wants us to live. And many Christians say like God created sex, so he has the right to decide where sex and when sex can take place. So I think that could be one way of saying it, that God's the creator. And so he gets to decide, and we want to obey and follow him.
There's actually some research that talks about couples, when they're interacting, the longer they wait to have sex, the better they are at communicating. I love that even though like taking out religion, research actually shows as well just the benefit of waiting to have sex, like you were saying, mentally, psychologically. And that as you get older, especially, it can be harder to see why you're waiting. And for me, one thing I want to help instill in my children is that people who are going to want to just have sex with you without waiting, without commitment, it's not really about them wanting you. It's about them just wanting your body. And depending on what you choose, that is going to be up to you. But for me, I wanted someone who was going to be through the thick and thin with me and want more than just pleasure with my body.
Mm-hmm.
And so as I chose to wait and date people and waited to be more intimate, I think it gave us a better foundation to really communicate and know that we wanted to be together for more than just this not lasting attraction
Yeah.
that was founded on our bodies versus on who we are as people.
Right.
So I think it can be so good to bring in our values, but also a lot of the research and a lot of the ways relationships are formed go along with what we're taught in faith traditions.
Think about the life skills and character traits that are being fostered in you as you wait to have sex. You can develop self-control, delayed gratification, communication, like you mentioned, like all of these really important life skills and skills for marriage can be cultivated by waiting. And so, yeah, there is a lot of times that the research aligns with Christian values.
And sometimes not.
Yeah.
It doesn't always.
But I see that too with the issue of cohabitation. The research says that couples who cohabitate before marriage have a higher divorce rate. And there's all sorts of different third factors that influence that. So it's not just the living together that directly causes that or anything, but it's a contributing factor. So I think that too is looking at just practical reasons can help to foster these values too, and not just the Bible says so. That's not always a compelling reason.
And it can still be hard. And our kids are going to get to choose, but I want to give them the understanding of some of the benefits, like what does happen when you choose to delay gratification, sexual gratification, and you're going to get to really know somebody better and know that like for me, I had an experience dating someone, and after I felt kind of used because I felt like he just wanted me to be a makeout buddy. And then it was such a stark contrast when I started dating my husband, because he would kiss me like once at the end of the night that we'd been talking for hours and hours. And so it was just this stark contrast of like, I know you want to be with me for me versus just because of my body.
Yeah.
And that it's fun to make out or, fun to cuddle. And so that was really helpful for me as well. Just thinking about that as I dated and kind of tried out some of these different relationships of someone who ended up just wanting to make out with me, I realized it's not really what I want. I want a deeper relationship. I think it can be helpful to help our kids recognize that. And of course, they're going to have trial and error that's going to help them learn as well.
Yes, they're going to make mistakes, I'm sure. And those mistakes are really evidence that they are thinking for themselves, which is honestly a trait that I want in my children.
Yeah.
It's not always easy when like my daughter won't wear the clothes that I want her to wear for school or something like that. I have to remind myself, I want her to think for herself. I want her to say no. I want her to be assertive and have a mind of her own. But yeah, when it comes to the decisions they make, we want them to be independent and to be assertive and to not be swayed just because that's what other people want them to do.
Yeah. And a huge part of purity culture, speaking about letting our kids choose which clothes they wear.
Oh, yeah.
I had to relinquish that a long time ago because my kids have very big opinions about, and it was okay. It was good. It was good for me to realize, because a lot of the reason I wanted to control what they were wearing is because I was worried about what people would think of me. And I realized that it's not about me.
I know.
But what are some of the ways that we can talk to our kids about modesty? Because that's a huge part of purity culture that can be really harmful for men and women.
Yeah, I get asked about that a lot because there are practical reasons to teach modesty to kids. And I think that's something I want to teach too, but I would base it more on practical reasons rather than just what the opposite sex thinks. That your clothing choice can be based on, does this feel comfortable? Does it work for the occasion or the setting we're in? Does it reflect your tastes and your character? So those practical considerations are more important than like, if I wear this, boys will look at me, or if I wear this, then they're going to be tempted, or then I'm going to be called names or judged. So instead, what I wear and how I act is about self-respect and respect for others. Again, coming back to respecting our body as a gift from God. And I respect the gift of certain private parts of my body that I only share with my husband. So I'm going to cover those up more. So I think that would be a way to explain it with kids.
And I think it's helpful too, because I know for me, that was a really harmful part of purity culture was modesty, because I was taught so much that what I wore was going to like cause these boys in my life to sin. And being able to separate, it was hard to separate that from myself. And so I self-objectified my body because I saw it as something that was going to make other people sin. So I hid it. So I think the intent is a huge part too. Like, I want to talk to my kids about, why are you dressing the way you are? And in my beliefs, if they're trying to get attention with their body, then maybe that's not the best outfit to wear. If they're feeling like they need to hide their body, that's probably not the best outfit to wear either. And just kind of helping them see like the intent you were talking about. Am I comfortable? Can I go out and look outward? Because I know when I'm wearing something, if I'm trying to get attention for my body or hide my body, or it doesn't fit, like I'm thinking about myself. But if I can kind of find this balance, I can look outward, which is what Jesus talks about, looking outward and serving and helping other people. And so that's been a big thing I've thought about with modesty as well. Instead of focusing on what the boys are going to think, focus on what is it showing and what's your intent? And is it going to work for the activity you're doing?
That's really good about intent and motivation. Like, what are your motivations or motives for wearing this outfit? What are you hoping to elicit from other people? And we really want them to wear what makes them feel good and what they feel like reflects their taste and their personality rather than just what other people think.
Yeah. And I think the biggest part that was really harmful about modesty culture for me was that it then instilled this idea that sex was just about how my body looked. So instead of seeing sex as this way to connect and show love and that the pleasure was about me, it was all about my husband being turned on because I'm a body and he needs my body to be fulfilled. And I think that's not probably what was intended for modesty culture, but that was a huge, really hard side effect that came into my life because of how modesty culture was taught, that my body made people get turned on.
Right. Yeah. And so that example illustrates that these effects, the way that we teach sex to our kids, the way that we talk about sexual values, have long lasting effects, whether you're single or married, whether you're male or female, whether you are a virgin when you get married or not. There's shame that we carry from childhood and from the way that sex was talked about. So I know that I'm going to make mistakes too. We're all doing the best that we can as parents. I really do believe that. But I hope that by your listeners and just everybody who's kind of in the trenches with us in this topic, that we can do the work on ourselves so that we really have self-reflected enough that we're not going to unintentionally pass on these negative messages to our kids.
Yeah. And I think it's been helpful to just realize for me, what messages did I receive from purity culture and how are they still affecting me? And that was one of the big ones, and especially viewing men's sexuality as uncontrollable, which is not true. And we need to teach our boys that they can control themselves, even though they are maybe more visually stimulated than women. I just think that the way we talk about modesty culture can be so good if we can shift it and be a way to empower our boys and our girls to see each other as human beings instead of objects for their gratification.
Yeah, exactly.
What would you say then about consent, and how did consent come up in a way that maybe it was previously taught in purity culture that's harmful, and how would you shift it?
Consent really wasn't talked about in purity culture, as far as my experience and as far as what my research and what I've read. It just really wasn't an issue. It wasn't talked about. And I think the assumption in my faith tradition is once you're married, consent just doesn't even exist. Once you're married, your body belongs to him, his body belongs to you. And it's kind of a really poor interpretation of that passage in 1 Corinthians, I think it is, that talks about this mutual giving and mutual sharing that we mentioned earlier, and gaining this experience of intimacy and twist it into you belong to him. And so you have no say or no agency.
Whenever he wants it, you're given.
Yeah.
That's your role as a wife.
Yes. Or else he's going to look at porn,
look somewhere else.
Or yeah.
Yeah.
And then it's your fault. I think respecting our kids' bodily autonomy and their right to make decisions about what's best for their body. We can say simple things like, you know, what's best for your body. Or when she tells me she's still hungry, like, I believe you. I don't understand how you could be, but I believe you. Or sometimes just little things like my daughter will say in the back of the car, I'm too hot or I'm too cold. And I'll say, thank you for telling me, let me adjust the air. You know, that just shows respect for her body, that I might feel differently, but I still respect how she's feeling. So don't force hugs and kisses with kids. I think that's always hard for me because you want to hug and kiss your little one, but really respecting their space and saying, okay, you're not ready for a hug right now. And don't force them to give hugs and kisses to family members either. And that can be hard with an older generation. We don't force them to give you a hug, or we stop when we're roughhousing. We stop when they say no instead of keep going, which is how I was brought up. That, you know, it was just my dad would keep going with the roughhousing. And I know he was wanting to connect and be playful and things like that. But when he does that with my daughter, I stop him. I tell him, like, Dad, we stop when she says no. And he does when I say that. And that's been really like healing for me to see that I can step in and be a voice for my daughter and model to her that this is okay to say, even to your grandfather who has good intentions.
Yes.
Really respecting their right to decide what's right for their bodies, unless it's like a health or safety issue. People will always ask me about, like, what are the exceptions to this? What if they need to brush their teeth, or they need to get a shot at the
change
doctor?
A diaper?
Yeah. Or putting them in the car seat and buckling their seatbelt, like things like that are safety and health issues. And my job as a parent is to keep you safe. And so I have to overstep your boundaries sometimes, or what you would like in this situation. So those would be exceptions to try to explain to kids, but definitely explaining like good touch and bad touch, safe people, who has a right to look at or touch your private parts and who doesn't. The differences between secrets and surprises is another thing that helps with consent and abuse prevention.
And if you're interested in this topic, I'll link, we have a whole episode on it from consent parenting. And she talks all about all these things that Dr. Camden just mentioned. I love what you said, because that's a big rule in our family. Like when someone says no or stop, we honor that. And it's been hard in some ways because I have one child who doesn't like to get kissed, and that can be hard as a parent, but I'm trying to show that I respect their body. And so because I know that they don't like to get kissed, I'll often ask if I can. Every once in a while, they say yes, but not very often. But it's been really good. And just, I love having these little conversations like we talked about earlier, just how talking about sex, talking about consent can just come up in these natural ways. And I just had a quick little story that happened the other day that just made my heart so happy. But my two kids were sitting talking, and for some reason it came up that they were talking about how many kids they were going to have when they got older. And my daughter said some number, and then my son was like, well, I'm going to have like 20. And my daughter turned to him and was like, well, you'll have to talk to whoever you marry if she's okay with that. And I was just like, yes, it's sinking in. Consent is sinking in. And so I just loved that little interaction.
Yeah.
This has been awesome, Dr. Camden. As we're closing up, could you just summarize a couple tips from this big discussion we've had of some of the ways we can shift talking about sex to a better place than maybe we were raised with purity culture?
First step would be do the work yourself first. Take the time to really reflect and deconstruct the ways that you were taught about sex and your own beliefs about sex, or your own beliefs about purity. What are you still hanging on to after all these years that you might not even realize can still be affecting you? Always start with yourself. And then secondly, it's not too late. Like we've said many times, if you've already maybe made some mistakes or done things a way that you want to take back or do differently. So it's not too late to change. And it's not too late to have an open and ongoing conversation with your kids. So don't shy away from questions or these really hard topics, but it's okay to also say, I don't know, or I'm not sure how to answer that. Let me think about it and get back to you, and really follow through with that. So we show our kids their questions are important and matter to us. It takes a lot of thought and intention, like everything with parenting. both parents hopefully getting on board with this. I'm not really an advocate for just mom talks to the girls and just dad talks to the boys about sex. We're both going to have these conversations. We can both answer and talk about it and be comfortable with it, because one day my children will be talking to an opposite sex spouse about it if they get married. So I want them to have that experience of having these conversations with someone of the opposite sex too. So getting on the same page with your spouse about these issues too is important.
Thank you so much. Can you tell us where we can find you and some of your resources?
Sure. Yeah. My website is drcamden.com, and that's my name on all the socials too. I'm most active on Instagram, so you can follow me there at Dr. Camden. And I have a free quiz on my website called Which Purity Culture Myth Affects You? So you can go and take this, I think it's 20 questions, and see which of the 5 myths of purity culture that I've identified in my research and writing still might be affecting you today. And it gives you these statements associated with each myth. So you can really see, like, have I said these things to my kids, or do I still believe these things? And what do I want to say instead? So that can be a great way to start that deconstruction process that I mentioned of reflecting and analyzing your own sexual beliefs.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I'll link all those in the show notes. Thank you so much for coming on.
All right. Thank you for having me and having this conversation.
I hope that you enjoyed this episode and that it was helpful for you in starting to think about how you want to teach your kids about values that are important to you. And there were so many things we could talk about, but just a couple of the things I was thinking about. I know we've talked about it in previous episodes, but I always love the reminder of just looking for ways that we can talk about sexuality in our everyday life with our kids. Things that will come up and can just be really natural conversations. When they're younger, this might just be talking about body parts and giving them the correct anatomical words to use. As they're older, it might be about consent and about body autonomy. And there's so many ways that we can just bring this into our everyday life that it can be, that little voice in our kids' head reminding them of things that we've talked about hundreds of times that can help them hopefully have a really positive view of sexuality and a positive view of values that you want to teach them. And then they get to go and choose how they want to interact and use the values that you have taught them. I also thought it was really good to remember talking about some of the benefits. Like we mentioned, research does back up some of these things that we talk about. And I think that can be really helpful for kids to realize, like, oh, if I wait to be sexual with someone that I'm interested in, we might be able to have better communication, and I might be able to recognize and know them better as a person than if I get involved more sexually earlier in my relationship with them. Just things that we can include that aren't just, okay, don't do it because this is what I think you should do or what our faith tradition teaches, but can really help kids think and understand why they may want to wait and why they may want to live by some of these values that might be really important to you, but giving them a chance to understand and then decide for themselves. It also reminded me of some of Dr. Jennifer Finlayson-Fife's research, where she talks about that women who were able to adjust well to their sexual relationships later in life after they got married and became sexual were the ones who had decided to wait to have sex until marriage or whatever they had decided, but they decided for themselves. They didn't decide based on, oh, if I have sex before I get married, I'm not going to be wanted by a future spouse. I'm not going to be worth anything. I'm not going to have my purity to give them. Like, they didn't make those choices based on shame or fear. They made those choices because they saw, wow, like, I want this type of marriage and I want this type of relationship. And so I'm choosing to act in this certain way to get the results that I'm wanting for my life. And I think that's a really powerful thing when we think about talking with our kids about these topics, is we can talk about our own experiences and why maybe it's been important for us, or include research and things that illustrate some of these points and how they can be helpful, just to help our kids really be able to make their decisions in an educated way. Anyway, I hope this was a great episode for you, and I hope that we can help shift these cultures that we may have grown up with to a better place and make these conversations open and safe for our kids so that they can come to us and ask questions, and we can be a space of safety to say, hey, I taught that wrong. Let me research that a little more, and I want to learn this together, or just to be a space where they want to learn from us and talk with us about things they're feeling and experiencing and wondering about. And if you haven't already, make sure to download the 10-question guide I have to help kickstart conversations with your spouse about sexuality. Like we mentioned in this episode, it's so important to start with ourselves and our own views of sex and sexuality to be able to have healthy conversations with our kids. You can find the link for that guide in the show notes. And I hope that this guide that I've provided will be helpful for you just to open up that conversation and comfort level of talking about sex between you and your spouse, so that it will be even easier then to talk with your kids because you've gotten to practice with your spouse. As always, thanks for talking love.
Thank you to all of you who listen and join me on this journey, and to our Ladies Talking Love team who make the podcast possible. Thanks to our sound wizard, Kimberly Demers, and our miscellaneous task whiz, Jana Norman. As always, thanks for talking love.